Good afternoon, and welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. In attendance today, we have, of course, myself, Chair of the committee, representing the 4th District, Councilman Cohen, representing the 1st District, Councilwoman Ramos, representing the 4th District.
14th.
Excuse me, 14th. You don't represent my district. We don't have 2 council members. And do we have any other members joining us virtually at the moment? And I see Councilmember Burnett is joining us virtually. All right. And Councilman Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. And from the President's office, I've got Mr. Preston in the background. And from the Mayor's office, Nina Themelis. Thank you, Nina. So this afternoon, the committee will have a hearing on legislative oversight, LO 21-0006, Quarterly Crime Stats and Violence Prevention Plan, for the purpose of the committee holding a hearing quarterly to review crime statistics for the police department and to monitor the progress of the biennial violence prevention plan. This bill was introduced on March 8th, 2021 by myself, Councilman Conway, we're here today under the Quarterly Crime Stats and Violence Prevention Plan to focus specifically on victim services in Baltimore City in order to gain further perspective from city agencies and authors and contributors of a landmark report regarding this topic. As part of the U.S. Department of Justice Public Safety Partnership Program that Baltimore entered in 2019, a report was commissioned to examine and assess how crime victims in Baltimore, particularly men and boys of color, are treated by the Baltimore Police Department and the adequacy of victim services systems in place. It is an incredibly detailed report, both in information gathered about the current state of affairs and in its recommendations. What is important to realize is that when we talk about victim services, we are speaking to a major part of the public safety issue here in Baltimore City. Victims of crimes and their families deserve to be treated with respect, compassion, and dignity at all times. But not only that, we know that poor relations between police and communities can mean that we breed fear and distrust. It means that people talk to police less often. They avoid police when possible, ultimately resulting in less effective policing in our police force at large. It means crimes, sometimes very serious crimes, go unsolved, and it ultimately means a less safe city. So the future of how crime victims are treated, and I would even be so bold to say that the crime fight at large rests particularly on Baltimore truly wrestling with the lived experiences that this report has captured and getting this area right. I'm looking forward to hearing about how that process is playing out, especially about that report. And joining us today, we have representatives from the Baltimore Police Department, from the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, to talk through their takeaways from the report and how the administration is responding to it. We are also joined by Heather Warnken, who is the lead drafter of the PSP report, and Lydia Watts, the executive director of the Rebuild, Overcome, and Rise, or ROAR, Center at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. We'll also have time for public testimony at the end of the hearing. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn it over to our panel today. Ms. Warnken.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.
You need to use the microphone.
Please use the microphone and state your name, affiliation.
Do you need me to hold it?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Heather Warnken, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore School of Law. I'm grateful to be here for this important hearing and conversation, and I would like to begin by providing some background on the assessment and the report that we're here to discuss today. Prior to my current role, I served as visiting fellow at the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, in the first ever position dedicated to bridging the gap between research, policy, and practice to improve the response to individuals and communities impacted by crime victimization. Through this role, I facilitated collaboration across federal, state, and local government partners, practitioners, researchers, and directly impacted communities in the design and implementation of equitable, data-informed policies and programs nationwide. One of the many hats I wore in this role was to serve as a subject matter expert in DOJ's Public Safety Partnership Program, working with cities nationwide in their efforts to address and reduce violence. When Baltimore entered this program in 2019, I was thrilled about the opportunity to support critical efforts to address these challenges here locally in my hometown. In addition to serving as one of 2 program champions for Baltimore, acting as a liaison between the city and the department's resources, attending regular meetings, strategic planning efforts, and more, I also had the opportunity to lead the city's victim services assessment as part of PSP. I would first like to share that this assessment was about listening. Too often, training and technical assistance initiatives involve outside, quote, experts parachuting in to offer advice or otherwise result in high-level reports disconnected from the real issues and challenges. Too often, these reports understandably end up sitting on a shelf in cities already overwhelmed or assessment fatigued. I was determined to offer a more useful and locally driven approach. Therefore, though this effort included a number of other rigorous research activities, the beating heart of this assessment was the over 50 hours of recorded confidential interviews with diverse stakeholders on the front lines of responding to residents impacted by violence in Baltimore every day. We endeavored to create safe spaces for this key constituency of those closest to the problems and therefore closest to the solutions to share their wisdom on their successes and their challenges. And that they did. The interviews, each approximately 90 minutes in length, produced an unbelievable amount of rich information on all topics ultimately covered in this report. The assessment was intentionally broad in that we sought to look at these issues across the entire ecosystem of response, conducting interviews with those working in the justice system, including sworn law enforcement personnel, in the community, public health settings, and more, because none of these responses exist in a vacuum. Frequently, people impacted by violence touch all of them. The scope of the assessment was also intentionally narrow. Though we were interested in the experience of all victims, we were hyper-focused on those who are so often most harmed yet least helped, least likely to be seen and served as victims of crime, Black men and youth, and especially those impacted by gun violence. Also important to note is that I was one of 4 team members carrying out this work, bringing a diversity of backgrounds and lenses, and which prioritized skills and experience, not just in understanding the needs of victims, but in identifying the barriers to trust, dignity, communication, and collaboration between government and community. I'm proud to represent my full team here today, including Kenton Kirby, Peter Pollard, and Amy Dural. As I mentioned, our team also reviewed extensive background material relevant to the local service landscape and response, including existing policies and procedures, programmatic materials, BPD's strategic and transformational plans and consent decree, and Monty's comprehensive violence prevention framework and plan. We also developed and disseminated a survey instrument specifically seeking to bolster participation and engagement beyond those participating in interviews. Though planning for the assessment preceded this time frame, the research and data collection took place from January through June of 2021. I also want to note that before a single finding or recommendation was produced, the value of this process itself. We heard repeatedly throughout the assessment how deeply participants valued feeling seen and heard, having the opportunity to share their insights and often long-standing frustrations in this work. I also want to note the importance of language in this process. I'm just waiting for the slide delay. This report includes a number of definitions, including terms such as the word victim itself, that can be complex and loaded, and concepts such as, quote, victim-centered and trauma-informed that have become so ubiquitous as to often be almost meaningless at this point. We defined these terms both to be clear about our usage and to model the importance of clarity over assumptions in this work. We also utilized person-first language throughout the report and made recommendations around its importance for BPD and city agencies, along with other recommended terminology changes that we posit can make a difference within BPD and other government entities in uplifting the dignity and humanity of those impacted by crime. As we note in the report introduction, quote, the response to those impacted by violence often has a direct and lasting impact on their lives, for some even greater than the victimization itself. In seeking to gather critical information about this response, the assessment pursued the following research questions. Identify gaps and barriers to accessing services. Identify issues that may contribute to a lack of engagement of victims and witnesses in the criminal justice process. Review and analyze current policies and processes in place for protecting those impacted by violence and other safety issues, and develop strategies for increasing collaboration among community stakeholders in order to provide trauma-informed services to victims. I will start by sharing some overall takeaways, and whatever remaining time I have, I am happy to get more specifically into findings and recommendations contained in the report. Overall, the reality that repeatedly emerged in this assessment is that Black residents impacted by violence, especially those who are poor or who have ever touched the justice system previously, are more likely to be criminalized than seen as human beings deserving of dignity and support. Even surviving loved ones of homicide victims, witnesses at crime scenes, and people fighting for their lives in hospital beds are experiencing additional trauma at the hands of BPD and the system more broadly. Rights violations, coercion, misinformation, barriers to existing services in the course of investigations and beyond. Service providers in multiple settings express they often feel they are expending their limited resources trying to protect victims from the system rather than proactively helping them heal. These dynamics don't just fail residents in their most difficult moments. They profoundly worsen the relationship between the community and police and the system as a whole. They undermine BPD's own investigative goals. They miss opportunities to interrupt cycles of harm and reduce the violence stated as top of every city leader's agenda. I commend MONSE and BPD on their many new commitments made in response to this report, especially the plans to greatly expand upon the long disinvested infrastructure of care vital to the safety and recovery of residents impacted by violence. But real change depends upon ensuring that it is actually accessible to those who need it the most. My view on the 22-page response issued by the city is that I fear in multiple places it is currently too vague or insufficient to achieve its desired goals and must be more thoroughly built out in collaboration with community partners on the front lines of this work, who play a critical overall, but certainly for those least trusting of the police and government as a whole. And it must be continually informed by residents impacted by violence, especially those most marginalized who face the greatest risk of victimization and ongoing harm. Though I understand the city's well-intended efforts to begin working on solutions prior to the public release of the report, part of the challenge created by waiting a year to release the document was how difficult that makes it to co-create a response with community, rather than a starting place of that collaboration where the community responds to existing plans. Even the assessment report itself was designed to provide a framework and a jumping off point for the dialogue. Though we developed these 21 recommendations through a meticulous process of listening and identifying opportunities and common ground among the rich local expertise, there should be more robust dialogue with non-governmental partners about whether we got it right. What, if anything, within these recommendations would they change, and how to meaningfully prioritize among them, as we have laid out in this report many years' worth of work. I also want to emphasize something I don't think we talk nearly enough about, especially in the context of such an exciting and unprecedented time of new funding toward public health approaches to violence across the country and in Baltimore. Yes, there are gaps to be filled, and there are opportunities in addressing with new funding the longstanding disinvestment in health and healing-oriented strategies that actually keep communities safe, and to move away from over-reliance on the carceral and enforcement-oriented strategies that have come with great collateral harm. But then there are the challenges that no amount of money alone can fix, and frankly, that throwing heaps of money at without addressing the implementation context can make worse. Perhaps the most important takeaway, one of the most important takeaways of this report, in my view, is that all the new funding, hires, and policy changes in the world could mean very little without the courage to do the more difficult, longer-term work of changing the culture in which new policies and programs must be implemented. Setting these new plans up for success and actually co-creating a new vision of safety with those most impacted, which is not to be confused with telling them about it on the back end, requires a level of urgency, transparency, and collaboration beyond that evident thus far. It requires honesty on what the starting point is, including the role of racism in determining whose harm matters and how very far we still have to go. It requires something well beyond talking points that we won't police or prosecute our way out of gun violence, but actions that repair and rebuild relationships rooted in dignity and a more holistic set of public safety goals. It was striking that among the interviews we conducted, it remained a frighteningly common experience that when asked the standard interview question, seeking of sharing a, quote, success story connected to their working relationship with BPD and effective engagement with victims, there were often blank stares, nervous laughter, or unequivocal responses that unfortunately they did not have those examples. This question was often adapted to try to pull out some things that had ever, quote, gone well, and if there were any identifiable ingredients to that outcome. A very important, notable exception to this, which is explored in depth in this report, were the many positives that emerged specifically regarding BPD's homicide advocacy program and its dedicated staff. However, it was clear that a number of factors speaking directly to the capacity, reach, and stature of this program within BPD have greatly limited the potential of this invaluable work. Overall, the interviews and other aspects of the assessment demonstrated the tremendous gulf between earnest efforts and commitments of leadership and many within BPD working very hard for change, and the persistent practical reality often felt by those impacted by violence across the city. Bridging this gulf between repeated promises of meaningful reform and the experiences of those impacted by violence remains more an aspiration than a reality. Many expressed growing less patient and less accommodating of the idea of, quote, reform, wanting nothing short at this point of transformational change. You will note there is a section on the consent decree in the report. We did not set out to write about the consent decree specifically, but needed to after it came up in nearly every interview we conducted. Respondents repeatedly emphasized how, at that time, 4 years into the consent decree, even as BPD claimed to be focused on relationships with the community and addressing instances of unconstitutional policing, this did not align with their everyday experience on the front lines of violence. In fact, midway through the assessment, a class action civil rights lawsuit was filed alleging in great detail a series of 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendment rights violations by BPD of gun violence victims. Routine practices we too were learning of and planning to highlight in this report. Numerous stakeholders described prior attempts to bring these issues to BPD's attention, hoping to collaborate to improve the response to victims and the working relationship with service providers. However, despite the commitment to problem-solving principles identified in the consent decree, BPD did not prioritize these issues as these issues escalated to a class action lawsuit. Neglect of these concerns resulted in the persistence of unnecessary and exacerbated trauma, which continue to this day, heightened vulnerability for repeat victimization for numerous gun violence survivors, and corrosive impacts on the community's trust and engagement with BPD. It also contributed to a perceived drain on the limited capacity of service providers in Baltimore, including hospital-based staff, case managers, pro bono attorneys, and more. These providers expressed how they continue to expend an unnecessary and inordinate amount of their time defending impacted survivors' interests and dignity, sometimes as they literally fought for their lives, and advocating for more trauma-informed, constitutionally sound practices by BPD. Ideally, they would be free to instead engage in more proactive provision of support services that foster healing, mitigate risk of repeat victimization or retaliation, and otherwise address the many needs of survivors in the wake of gun violence. The profound sadness and frustration revealed by those on the front lines of these challenges, trying to educate and collaborate toward better outcomes, was palpable. For many, the exhaustion in the face of setbacks and the backdrop of a consent decree they do not perceive as effective often seems like it steepens an already uphill climb of preventing violence and interrupting cycles of harm. It's also important to note the insights and feedback were not all negative. Numerous participants, even among BPD's harshest critics, expressed a considerable level of empathy and passion and compassion for the police. This was also often expressed in an acknowledgement of the staggering amounts of unaddressed trauma within the agency due to the nature of the job and recent events, how ill-suited BPD is to effectively carry out many of the outsized responsibilities piled on its plate, and the lack of investment in many of the complementary programs and more appropriate responses necessary to address and reduce harm. This compassion, empathy, and even shared frustration are promising and important assets for this work ahead, including implementation of many of the identified recommendations. There was a great deal of motivation and common ground across these interviews that a new vision of shared safety and collaboration can and must be achieved. Now, I am just going to very briefly now touch on a few of the findings and recommendations, but I hope that through the course of additional testimony by others, including public comment, as well as our dialogue today, we might be able to get into more specifics that you are interested in. But I wanted to start by highlighting finding 1 in the report. The first finding is the pervasive and enduring role of racism, which threads through nearly all other topics addressed. The historic record and lived experience of many residents are replete with examples of how strategies for controlling communities of color have influenced policing and the victim service infrastructure, and has traumatized those communities with little to no discernible accountability. The resulting muscle memory of the system fosters a deeply rooted bias that non-white bodies and certain forms of violence are less deserving of humanity and dignity than others. The report lays out in depth the reasons this is not only deeply flawed from a legal and moral standpoint, but the research-backed reasons why this inequity undermines public safety. Again, just highlighting some things to help put some placeholders in for future discussion. Also covered is the notion of deserving versus undeserving victims, including the problematic dichotomy between victims and perpetrators. Again, missed opportunities for leveraging the consent decree in more strategic ways. Who should be counted as people impacted by violence, and the impact of trauma on victims, service providers, others working with within community violence intervention ecosystem, and law enforcement. the importance of trust to safety and collaboration, including the need to build relationships in the absence of crisis, so when that crisis does occur, a meaningful and trusted connection is already there. Empathy as a requirement. We heard a lot in the assessment interviews about the differentiation between, quote, practical hard skills in law enforcement versus, quote, softer skills, such as the empathy and the interactions with the human beings they're experiencing in their work that too often gets deprioritized in the context of law enforcement training, and that cannot be delegated to professional staff within the department. Underutilization and lack of appreciation for BPD victim services, including the urgent need for changing the approach to death notifications, which I know the department has already undertaken some important work on. The need for strengthened coordination across victim service providers, especially for gun violence and in homicide cases where there is no arrest. There's a lot in this report how there is not only a gap, but what I describe as a canyon between the opportunity to connect with many of the services and funding behind them that attaches with the state's attorney's office level when an arrest has been made, and the huge amount of victims in the city, especially for non-fatal gun violence, that are never going to make it to that point. Barriers to relocation, including categorical exclusions of eligibility that make critical safety resources unavailable to many who need them most. Coercive practices to compel, quote, cooperation, which undermine both healing and investigations. I put that in air quotes for a reason. There's a recommendation in the report also around the topic of terms matter, how loaded and dehumanizing even the constant use of the framework of cooperation can be, and how powerful it can be to shift that framework to participation by survivors in the system rather than coercing their cooperation. Inequity and challenges with victim compensation and victims' rights enforcement. Lack of awareness of the service landscape and resources available for victims, and the need for resource mapping, especially at the grassroots and neighborhood level. Lack of trauma-informed response at crime scenes. Coercive and counterproductive practices in hospital settings specifically. Aligned with many of what the allegations listed in the Cotman lawsuit, we heard a lot about not just the confiscation of property, but other related practices such as refusing visitors, threatening parole and probation violations for gunshot victims who might have a prior record. Implications of underfunding, of lack of awareness of community violence intervention, and implications for the group violence reduction strategy. And lastly, I will note a striking finding in the report around the disconnect between what often came out in sworn law enforcement personnel interviews about the role of stop snitching culture and the ways in which that creates brick walls to information or collaboration compared to a much different and oftentimes rich, more detailed analysis from service providers who had a different lens on the people that they were working with and a different lens on the impact of trauma, talking about all the many ways why it is not pragmatic often for victims to participate in a system that cannot follow through on its safety, either physically or emotionally. Again, I know we are out of time, so I'm gonna yield and pass the mic to Lydia from ROAR to further her testimony, but I'm happy at any point to take questions both within the context of the hearing and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Warnken.
Good afternoon. Whoops, is it on? Do I have to do, oh, look, there it is, okay. Good afternoon, my name's Lydia Watts. I'm the Executive Director of the Rebuild, Overcome, and Rise, or ROAR Center at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about my background because I think it is relevant to much of what I would like to share. I've been an attorney for 26 years, but about 5 years prior to that, I had started as an advocate for intimate partner violence survivors. And that was what much of my practice as a lawyer has been, representing survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence. Most of that time in Washington, D.C., and then I grew up in Massachusetts. I went home for about 6 years and did that in Massachusetts as well. And I share that because I'm relatively new to Baltimore City. I started this job in January of 2019, and there was a lot to learn, and I'm still on that learning curve. But what I will also share is that I had the experience of doing this work with the similar parties, and a lot of these challenges that I'm experiencing are ones that I've experienced in other cities, and I think it really does often go back to the culture that of law enforcement, often seeing themselves as adversaries with attorneys, and with insufficient, the demand far outstripping our resources to meet the demand. In other words, there are so many survivors of violence that even when we have the best of intentions, that many of them fall between the cracks. So in my comments, I don't mean to point fingers at Baltimore City as being different than other places. I think we all struggle with the challenges that we see here. I also want to mention that I also have started a number of nonprofits during my time, and I actually worked as an organizational development consultant. So there will be times where I'm going to put that hat on in my comments as well. And then finally, I'm an MPH student as a Bloomberg American Health Initiative Fellow at Hopkins right now, and my cohort is the violence prevention cohort. So I'm drawing on many sort of public health information, my experience as a lawyer, my experience in other cities, as well as an organizational development consultant. So what is ROAR? I've been in these chambers talking to past councils about what ROAR is pre-pandemic, but I'll just refresh everyone's memory. We are a center devoted to serving victims of crime, very focused in Baltimore City. So all of the survivors that we serve are here in the city. Number of reasons for that, but I'll just roughly say because so many other providers tend to avoid the city for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is that we're not an MDEC at the court system, so you have to drive to the courthouse to file things. It's very important for lawyers that can you e-file. I hate to make it so about those kinds of systems, but sadly true. ROAR has on staff lawyers, social workers that are case managers, as well as therapists, and a nurse care manager on staff. Our intention in creating that array of disciplines, and forgive me, also have most recently a credible messenger on staff as well, our most recent hire. And the intention of having that multidisciplinary team is really in recognition of so much of what Heather was speaking of, is that the needs of crime survivors are very very complex and require, when at their initiative, of course, and at their decision making, but often, there are times that a lawyer is needed, a time that a therapist is needed, a time that a nurse is needed. And I'll just share one case example without sharing any identifying information, where we worked with a family where they had come to us the mom came to us having lost her older son to gun violence some years in the past. It had really, as I'm sure we all can understand, still reverberating through that family greatly. She had 5 children. The oldest had been killed here in the city. So she had 4 remaining children of widespread of ages, so they were in different schools throughout the city. She herself, after her son's death, was unable to continue working because of the grief and trauma. She was no longer earning an income, so was living only on public benefits. Was having a really tough time really being able to get the kids to school in a timely way, again, because of the trauma and her own fear about the children being out in public, going to school, and again, at various different schools throughout the city. And was really, really having a tough time keeping it together. So initially, she was working with our social workers on doing some trauma therapy with the kids, getting them into therapy. And while we were working with her, her second oldest son was shot. He was not immediately killed, so he was on life support for 2 weeks at shock trauma. And in those 2 weeks, she, of course, was by his bedside the entire time. And the 3 younger children, the next oldest was theoretically old enough to be caring for the children, but not for weeks at a time. So there was really no one there to really make sure the children were going to school, making sure the children were getting emergency assistance, were even being fed. So that's where our team was able to step in, not only buy food, but also be able to help mom with the very important decision that she had to make, the very decision that no parent ever wants to make of, do I take my son off of life support, which she did ultimately decide to do. And then there was the need to pay for a funeral, the second funeral in as many years, for a very low income family. So we were able to also use funds that we had received, ARPA funds that we very graciously and gratefully received from Monzi, to help pay for that funeral service, for the repast, for the clothing for the kids so they could be in appropriate clothes for those ceremonies. And I share that because it really illustrates all of the many ways in which someone's life is impacted by harm. And I think it's intuitive on some level, but when we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who has gone through that level of loss and trauma, it really puts it in perspective of all of the ways that one's life is impacted and all of the many ways that assistance is needed. So ROAR's attorneys also are what are called crime victims' rights attorneys. Under the Maryland Constitution, there are enumerated rights that crime victims have, most notably to be treated with dignity and respect. There are also others about notice, being allowed to be heard if there is a criminal proceeding, as well as a right to privacy, which is another issue that comes up regularly. Crime victims' rights attorneys are relatively novel in Baltimore City. Again, that MDEC and the antiquated systems that we have. In the rest of the state, there's actually a field that and a notice of appearance that allows for crime victims' rights attorneys to enter their appearance. Here in Baltimore City, we're inevitably put in as defense attorneys, which we are not. And that is it's only one sort of illustrative factor on why I think we have so much difficulty communicating with the police department. Is when we call and we say, I'm representing, Mrs. Wagner, the detectives that we're contacting, I think, this is me sort of trying to step into their mindset, are thinking we're defense attorneys. And so that immediate sort of, I can't share information with you, this is an ongoing investigation, and it's a real wall of communication, even though we're calling only to find out, how is the investigation going. She wants to know, is any information on who killed her son. And we are often met with what I'll only call a wall of secrecy. I'm very eager for all of the efforts that Monzi and BBD have committed to, and I work with Director Jackson all the time, and so I have very high hopes that we're in a state of change, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to share with the City Council some of the things or just how deeply change is needed. I know change takes a long time, and much of this is baked into the culture of BPD and candidly, of decades, if not centuries, of not only racism, but also that only incarceration is the only answer to this kind of violence. When what we're seeing is that people that were shot and treated as if they're criminals leave the hospital much more likely to not only engage in retaliatory shooting, but feel as if no one cared about me the first time, no one's cared about me my whole life. I grew up in a neighborhood where there are no parks. I grew up where there are no grocery stores. I went to schools where there's no heating. The message is so clear that I am not valued, and that then the likelihood that person then engages in additional violence or escalates that violence is very, very high. And I would submit to the City Council and to anyone who's listening that the only way we are actually going to see significant reduction in gun violence is if we pursue these. Of course, there's a role for the police. I'm not in any way saying in lieu of policing, but that we also need to be treating victims with compassion, with transparency, and with action. And I do commend James Dixon, who, yes, there you are, and his team and all that they do for survivors, and now that they are working with the folks from the Western who are non-fatally shot. Again, we have hopes that there will be significant reform. I had mentioned working in the intimate partner and sexual violence realm for a reason. When I first started this, if you've done the math in your head, it was the late 80s. And that was prior to the Violence Against Women Act being passed by Congress. It was prior to significant investments being made into the systems of support that currently exist for survivors of those types of crimes. And when I moved to Baltimore City, and what I didn't say is about 50% of the folks who come to ROAR are either non-fatal gunshot survivors or homicide victims. So that's the vast majority of the folks who come to us that's the most recent victimization. Also, most of the folks who come to us have been victimized oftentimes from very early age, right? Either child abuse, child sexual abuse, multiple polyvictimization is the technical term. But I mentioned that because when I first started meeting with the folks at Shock Trauma that do the bedside intervention and hearing from them what their clients, what their patients need, and how they were being treated by all of the systems, it really felt like I had stepped back in time to 1980, late 80s, when I was working with survivors of intimate partner violence. And what I will submit is that with that significant investment of attention and resources and expertise, we have seen a significant shift. And I know we can do the same for gun violence survivors, because when they are seen as human beings, I say this always with like a little bit of irony, right? Like we have to actually see them as human beings and not as, thugs and criminals. Now, I'm not naive. I know that many people who are shot in the city are also causing harm, right? I'm not saying that they're angels necessarily, but at that moment that they have been shot, they are extremely vulnerable, they are extremely raw, many times they're fighting for their lives, and that at that moment, what they deserve is our care and compassion, and that the police, I believe, I'm not a police officer, but I believe that the police will be more successful in meeting their goals if they treat survivors with a level of compassion and care, that their investigations will be much more likely to be participated in. So I will just end with saying that what I am hopeful for, because again, I have read the document submitted by MONSE and BPD, and I'm very excited about many of their commitments, is it's a lot, right? It's a lot to do in a short period of time. And what I'm hopeful for is to really be a part of an ecosystem with all of the other efforts in the city. And as I mentioned, we do get funding from MONSE. We get ARPA funds. We also get VOCA funds from the governor. And this is where my organizational consultant hat comes on, is how can we really build this ecosystem in a way that, and I know, Shantae, this is your hope and dream, but what can we do to support MONSE and really intentionally building an ecosystem where information is shared appropriately. Obviously, we have confidentiality, where who's the best person to respond at what time, and currently it's our experience that we're often sort of finding out about things after the fact, or realizing there are resources that we didn't know about. And so again, I am fully cognizant that change takes time, and I am fully committed to being in true partnership with MONSE and BPD and seeing these reforms through. And whatever we need, again, my organizational development hat is like, we need to sit in the same room and we really need to map out this ecosystem and make a commitment to it. And that, as Heather very rightfully testified to, bringing into that planning those most affected by gun violence in this community. And I think their voices are the ones that we often miss. We at ROAR convened a summit on May 11th, and Director Jackson was there, as many of the other panelists, where we heard directly from gun violence survivors. And we have a beautiful graphic recording of what we broke into affinity groups, where male survivors were in one group, female survivors in another, family members who had lost loved ones, systems people like us, and frontline folks. And each of those affinity groups reported out. And it's a great graphic representation of the voices of all of those sectors. And had I thought of this in advance, I would have shared that with you all, but I will certainly email it to you, council member, and so that you may broadly disseminate it. But it is a really beautiful graphic of, I think, so much of what is in Heather's report. And with that, I will just say thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you both. And I'll say, in reading the report, I really appreciate the detail that you went into, Ms. Warnken, about why this work is important, why we need to be incredibly careful and thoughtful in our interactions with, especially shooting victims, but victims across the board. What I'll do is I will open up the floor to questions before we actually go to Monty and BPD for folks who may have questions. I don't have any questions at the moment. Councilman Costello, any questions? Councilman Cohen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report. Good to see you, Lydia. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you to all the folks that are here today. We'll say I am a little concerned at the lack of police leadership in this room right now, and appreciate that you're here, Shannon. I know that Mr. Worley was here, but would expect BPD to be here for this conversation and show up a little more than they currently are. So would just note that I think it's important for leadership to absorb this information and be part of a dialogue with the City Council on this really important topic. Appreciate the report, also appreciate the depth, the interviews, the methodology. Couple of things I want to drill down on. One was, and I think Lydia, you and I have talked at one point about this, the issue of crime scenes. I was actually at a crime scene relatively recently. It's about maybe like 3 or 4 hours after a shooting took place, and the blood was still there. Everything looked a mess. The markers of where the ballistics were found were still there. And I remember, because I walked there and was talking to some people, there's one woman who was really upset. She didn't know who the victim was, she didn't know who the shooter was, but just having blood all over her street was incredibly traumatizing and upsetting. That seems like something we can solve. Like, there's a lot of this that I think is deep generational culture change work that I think is around trauma and going to take a really long time. But this issue of why can't we clean up the crime scenes more expeditiously and with a little more purpose? Because I think it does send a message to not only victims, but also communities that a couple hours later, there's still blood all over the place. I'm pretty sure forensics had already come and done whatever it is they're gonna do. And so, this is partly a question to BPD, it's partly a question to Director Jackson, but I mean, maybe to you all as well. But I am curious, just sort of protocols for how this could work, where we're not leaving blood on the pavement and just completely re-traumatizing communities that have already been through it with a shooting. Any just quick recommendations on maybe other places that are doing this better than we are, or how we could more effectively make sure that as part of the protocol for evidence collection, that we then clean up the scene and don't leave it behind?
Yeah, of course, BPD would be able to answer this question better than I, but it was so appalling to me when survivors would come and tell me about this exact scenario, that I did dig a little bit, and it's my understanding that the fire department is the next responder to come and to hose down the blood. I don't know who is supposed to initiate that, like I don't know how that communication happens. But I will also note that that would only be true if it's in a public place. And we've had a number of survivors where the shooting took place in a home. One was when our client's husband was walking out of his home. It was mistaken identity, but he was gunned down as he opened his front door and was killed. So there was literally his gray matter on the wall that his wife, our client, had to clean up. So you can imagine how horrifying. Another instance where our client was an intimate partner violence survivor and was shot by her boyfriend in her home, and her adult son had to clean that up. And there really isn't any alternative other than hiring, a cleaning service that, when you're dealing with, human blood and biological matter, it's very, very expensive. And theoretically, someone could get reimbursed through crime injuries compensation, but that's a very lengthy process and no guarantee of success. So I do see that as a pressing need. I worked with a woman who was at Poe Homes. She was not involved with who was shot, but her 5-year-old son was having to step over the blood outside of their doorway days later. And eventually, the groundskeeper for the Department of Housing came through and hosed down the blood. But I would submit, that blood is now in the grass where the kids are playing. If this was a community in Roland Park, I can assure you all of those parents would be outraged that that was the best that could be done, and that where their children are playing is, diluted blood. Never mind the days of trauma of that 5-year-old stepping over this the pool of blood. So yes, I absolutely agree with you, Councilman, and look forward to problem solving about how we can assure that many layers of additional trauma, that we can minimize that to the best of our ability.
Yeah, those are powerful examples that I think obviously illustrate the importance of this point. I will just add briefly, there's a section on page 34 of the report that talks about the findings, what we heard in the interviews related to this topic. It did come up frequently, and also a recommendation, a corresponding recommendation speaking to it on page 54. To me, it comes down to a few key points. One has to do, very practically speaking, because to your question, Councilman, what do we do about it? Very practically speaking, the delegation and list of responsibilities assigned to BPD personnel that show up at those crime scenes. Currently, they may include things like securing the perimeter and evidence collection and some very important tasks, but currently do not necessarily include the list of things that have to do with taking care of people and the situational awareness about the things that are correspondingly traumatizing to those who are also there. And that gets to my second piece, co-response, to make sure that people are responding to crime scenes who have a different set of responsibilities and training and lenses to understand the things that need to get done. And then also back to Lydia's point, the services, then the follow-up, if something's happening in a home, is it realistic for someone to get the follow-up support to get reimbursed for things that can be very expensive and overwhelming, like crime scene cleanup? And I would point you to the victim compensation section of the report. And it also, the last thing I'll say on this, I think, is illustrative of what I think overall is important around filling in the specifics around these important commitments that the city has made in response. This is one where, BPD and the mayor's office have agreed with this, have said they're going to address it now. What does it look like to get very specific about those plans?
Yeah, before going to my second question, I would just pose to you, Director Jackson, that I don't know what a reasonable amount of time is, but maybe within a month or so, you could come back to the council, to this committee, and report back on a procedure specifically related to this issue, because again, it seems solvable, and you're the agency, I think, that is best positioned to solve it.
I will take you up on that. We'll ask that for a complete follow-up. I will also kind of tag on to that issue. I wasn't going to do this, but there's also been an issue, I believe, with the coroner response to crime scenes in which we've had bodies on the street for hours on end, drawing crowds, and once again, that sort of dignity within the situation for that family, for the folks in that block. And so I understand that's a state service, and any coordination we can do with the coroner's office would be really, really helpful in consideration for that follow-up.
Thank you. My second question, so I mentioned this to you before the hearing, Ms. Warnken. We are, one thing we're proud of in the city is we're the first to have legislated trauma-informed care into law. We have been working in very close partnership with MONSE and our library system and our health department, really trying to go deep on what it means to, I think to put it in your parlance, not just train folks, but shift culture. And what we've seen in our libraries is some real genuine cultural shift, including policy shift, where our head librarian identified at the end of this training that one policy she was not comfortable with was zero tolerance, where we were treating folks who suffer from substance use disorder as criminals and kicking them out of libraries. And she instead determined to bring in peer recovery coaches starting at Penn North in West Baltimore, and has been slowly doing that in more and more branches across the city. I would just pose, and spoke to Director Jackson and Commissioner Harrison a little before this hearing, but just in light of the significant findings in this report, I know that we're slated to work next with Recreation and Park, but if there is a subset of officers that specifically work with victims of violence, we would be happy to try to figure out a way to support them in the next round of training as well. I think it's incredibly important that when our police speak to folks who have been shot, that they're not treated as criminals, regardless of whatever is in their background, that they're treated as victims, as this report suggests. And I do think that takes some real mindset shift within the department, knowing that, part of why we're under a consent decree is because of patterns and practices that leaned very, very heavily into Black and brown communities to extract evidence and information to catch killers, which, we want violent criminals off our streets, but not at the expense of re-traumatizing victims, not at the expense of further perpetuating a cycle where folks who are now literally in the hospital are, caught up in what could then become retaliatory. And I know that your office is working on some hospital responder models, and I think that's really important. But just wanted to put that out there. Director Jackson and Shannon, BPD, I think this is urgent, and if we can be helpful in supporting that cultural transformation, would love to be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Ramos. And I want to limit the questions to our panel first. We're going to hear from Monty and BPD shortly thereafter.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it, Mr. Chair. I do have a question. Something that you mentioned from the Roar experience is something that I keep talking about, so I'm going to highlight it. You mentioned that the conversations that you both have had around speaking with victims and their families is the re-traumatization in so many acute ways, but also the fact that just through where they live is also part of what's happening here, because we historically have said, we don't care about your neighborhood, but you have to live there anyway. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things, like just from a policy standpoint, we're working hard on addressing vacant and abandoned properties, but have a conflict internally about where to start. And to me, it's about starting in the areas that need it most, because historically, people are feeling like we don't care. And that's not fair to them. That's not fair to their families. That's not fair to the children. That's not fair to the communities. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. I know it's not directly related here, but it is something that I think sort of it comes to this, where, you know, somebody became a victim or became shot or is part of the criminal justice system or did shoot, frankly, because we didn't act and weren't preventative to begin with on addressing some of these issues because of our racial housing policies.
Absolutely. I mean, housing, it's all so interrelated, right? All of these issues.
Yeah.
And housing, far and away, is the biggest request of folks when they come to us, that they want to move. They don't want to live in that neighborhood anymore.
Yeah.
Perhaps never did, but didn't feel like, you know, they didn't have any meaningful alternatives. So, you know, I don't think this is a surprise to anybody in this room that racism and poverty are at the very core of gun violence and all violence, but gun violence in particular. And so absolutely, I think mapping those communities where there are the highest rates of gun violence are also those communities. I mean, it maps perfectly to the history of redlining, and it maps perfectly to what we know are the communities where there are the highest rates of abandoned buildings or vacant buildings. So yeah, it's all very, very intertwined, and that message of I am not important, no one cares about me, it absolutely is palpable to so many of the folks that come to Roar. And in fact, one of the biggest benefits that our clients, we've done listening sessions and asked them, you know, what did you feel like was success? You know, and it could be, oh, I wasn't evicted from my home, or it could be, I understood trauma better. The number one thing that people said is, I have a greater sense of self-worth because you all treated me well. And it's almost embarrassing because it's just good customer service, right? We answer the phones, we return their phone calls, we express empathy with what they're saying, and we try our very best to get them the resources that they need and to give them the, you know, to be in court with them, to give them the therapy that they need to show up when they're applying for benefits. Our nurse care manager is vigilant at getting people connected to care when they have either chronic health issues or acute health issues, often related to the violence. So just having, you know, again, what higher income folks expect, and being able to deliver that to folks who have never or very rarely experienced that in their life is, by their own words, the most important thing that they get from Roar. So yeah, and the fact that housing is the number one request, and to be candid, it is the hardest one to meet, right? Yeah. Our lawyers can show up in court, our therapists can schedule a session, but our case managers who are trying to find an affordable, safe place for families to live, it is extraordinarily difficult to find. So, you know, and even when, you know, we work very closely with Mark at the Department of Health, who has been very incredibly beneficial in getting us resources to relocate. And there's so much more than just relocating, right? Because people also then are outside of the communities they've known their whole lives. They're away from their church community, maybe away from their parents, or, you know, away from their best friend who lives down the block. So oftentimes we see people who may have been relocated saying, you know, now I live in rural Pennsylvania and I'm safe, but I miss Baltimore. That's where my home is. That's where my community is. So how do we create safe, affordable options for people to remain in the city that they love is, I think, key to much of what we're talking about.
Yeah, that second part is where I was going with my second question, in terms of, because I didn't see it in the report, in terms of what are the services that people are asking for most. So you answered my question, because I figured that was the answer, actually, but I wanted to have that articulated, because it is I think one of the bases for the beginning of healing, frankly. And so I appreciate it. Thank you. That's all for now, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ramos. I've got a question, and I hope you guys can help us begin to answer this question. Ms. Warnken, you alluded in the beginning of your presentation that you were concerned that some of the proposals that we'll hear a little bit about later were too vague and maybe insufficient to actually reach our goals And namely, you said that the big thing that we need to do is change culture. I'm really curious what that looks like, and have we seen that happen in other cities, that culture change? Has it happened successfully in other cities? And what can we potentially learn from those cities?
Sure. That's a big and important question. The first thing I'll say in response to it is that process matters just as much as substance. And I think it's already come up a few times today in different ways, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Monsi and BPD on this, on how important it is and how difficult it can be sometimes to truly co-create these plans with community. So I definitely think, and I know some steps have been taken to this end, convening the new version of the working group and other efforts to roll up our sleeves and look at these, what are designed to be very action-oriented and actionable recommendations in the report, and start working on that together. I will also say, I just will point out on page 44 of the report, there's a section entitled Opportunities to Fill Gaps or Enhance Trauma-Informed Services for Those Who Do Seek Help, and that's meant to be a listing of some of those frequently requested services that are often unavailable or inaccessible. But that loops back to your question, because again, a lot of these things aren't about, oh, we don't have access to these things right now, or they don't exist. Oftentimes, there might be a version of it that does exist. It's just not realistic for the people that need it the most. And so the report talks a lot about the different ways that red tape, what can be accessed. Things like, for example, is something available 24/7? Can you connect with someone and connect to that resource 24/7, or is BPD the only one you can call at those hours? There's a long list of these things, but culture eats policy for breakfast, and until we can get at that, and it takes a really long time, but I think that one of the key ingredients, and it's the one that's the hardest to do, the one that's most frequently overlooked, has to do with the reconciliation piece. The real honest reckoning about how much pain and harm, especially around how these issues have been addressed to date, still exists in communities as sort of a baseline to start building the level of trust that's even necessary for the collaborating on how we move forward. And there are a lot of pieces in the recommendation section that are very tangible, things like, how do we build a new protocol for crime scene response that could change the way this looks tomorrow? And then there are a lot, and there's a very important reason why recommendation 1 in the report is prioritize trust and relationship building with the community to a much greater extent, especially as it relates to violent crime, and lays out a lot of specifics about that. It is the principal recommendation, and it's the one that all of the remaining ones are predicated upon. And I think it was very clear, and I talked about this with respect to the consent decree, there's a key constituency of folks that BPD and others might be missing currently in their efforts to build trust. I think it's really hard in this work to not see community as a monolith. And we're talking about victim service providers, violence intervention specialists, and people who have experienced violence. We haven't been listening to them as much as we could to inform this and to try to make inroads on that culture change and trust building.
And I'll sort of follow up the back end of that question with this. There may be somebody watching this hearing right now that is thinking, oh, these are the people who are doing the shooting, who are doing the violence, who are the very problem. I think you've begun to answer this question already, but why do you believe it's important that we still treat folks with dignity regardless? I can answer that question, but I want you to, because I think it's important for kind of setting the stage for that culture change, why that culture change is necessary. But if you could answer that, that would be helpful.
Definitely. I think we've been talking about it all day, the importance for why, from a moral and legal standpoint, this is so critical. but it's also just so critical to actually effectively addressing and reducing violent crime. You know, I think the report lays out a lot of the different ways in which these practices, and again, I use that term muscle memory of the system. I don't think this is all about cruelty. This is all about, you know, trying to dehumanize people. It was so clear to me in the assessment, especially being able to kind of look across a landscape where you were asking the same questions to people who are coming at the issues from different lenses and roles, that especially from sworn law enforcement, who ultimately were doing things that were pretty jaw-dropping in terms of the ways in which they were exacerbating trauma, were coming at it from this very well-intended and in some cases sort of desperate attempt to move investigations forward, to extract information, ultimately to pursue arrest and conviction without awareness of the collateral consequences of that were actually undermining their ability to investigate cases. So there's a very pragmatic piece of this that you cannot effectively address and reduce violent crime when you dehumanize the community that you by necessity need as partners in addressing and reducing violent crime.
And if I may add an example from my work in the District of Columbia, Councilmember Cohen, you'll appreciate this. This was in the early, well, let's say like 2012. There was Human Rights Watch had done a report about sexual assault investigations done by the Metropolitan Police Department, and it went before the City Council, and there was all sorts of oversight. And one of the most significant pieces of legislation that was passed was requiring all detectives that were going to be investigating sexual violence claims to do a very thorough trauma training. And even just exposing police officers to what trauma does to the brain and why it is that interrogating a survivor of crime immediately after the crime actually is not going to get you meaningful information, right? We know that it takes 2 full sleep cycles for the brain to be able to incorporate the experience and actually embed it as a meaningful memory as opposed to a trauma-informed memory. And that is recognized by most police departments around the country. When there's an officer-involved shooting, they allow the police officer those 2 full days before the officer is questioned about what happened. So applying that same, treating them with dignity and respect, but also where the science tells us is going to be most meaningful. That interrogation that's happening immediately after is not going to extract evidence that's helpful. And when the police officers, one of the examples that my staff shared with me was a young man that was shot in the back and was paralyzed as a result and will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And the officer that came to the hospital asked him, "Who shot you?" And he said, "I don't know." And I'm sure that is the answer they get repeatedly. But coming at that from the perspective of you just don't want to tell us because maybe you're also involved, or the no snitch idea, rather than viewing him as somebody who is now permanently disabled for the rest of his life. And he was only 20 when that happened. So very young man who's going to spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And when our attorneys called that detective and asked, where's the investigation, she replied, he didn't tell me who shot him. I don't know what you want me to do. Which is, sort of, again, like, well, aren't you the police? Like, aren't there video camera? Isn't there something? Aren't there people around you could talk to? So the assumption that there was nothing that could be done because even if untrue, that he did know who shot him, that there was nothing further that was done is obviously a risk to public safety for all of us. So again, I'm not naive as to think that every single person who gets shot, it's a mistaken identity or wrong place, wrong time. I know that there are people that have engaged in harm doing that are now being harmed. But again, that this is the opportunity to engage with them. And I've talked to some detectives who have totally get it. And they say the first thing I ask is, who do you want me to call? Do you want to talk to your mom? Let's get your mom on the line. And that those officers, I haven't done an empirical research, but that they have a much better outcome in their investigation than those who, ask, who did you shot me, and then never talk to the victim again.
Yeah.
And if I may just very briefly connect the dots on a couple of other things related to this. One, that whole designation, whether the person knows who shot them or not, that designation then that an officer's interpreting that as them being, quote, non-cooperative, that might be the end of their ability or their family's ability to access criminal injury compensation board benefits. So all of these designations and putting someone in the worthy versus unworthy bucket has a ripple effect that then may be directly related to why they are denied the support services that help set up future stability in their life that'll mitigate their future risk of being involved in victimization. And the second point that really, I think, specifically connects these dots, I mentioned it earlier, what we were hearing about the frequent threats or coercive use of someone's parole or probation status, wielded as sort of a tactic to try to get information, even if the person's victimization had nothing to do with their prior criminal or juvenile justice system involvement, and how that attempt to get information in that moment, maybe from a well-intended idea, like I'm gonna get information that then can further this case in the name of public safety, creates, one, a perception from that person that the system doesn't care about them as a human being if they're using their victimization as a way to punish them. But two, that actual violation may again impede their ability to have resources, safe housing, other aspects of reentry that gets compromised the deeper into the system that someone gets.
Thank you both. I want to make sure we actually do turn it over to Monty to hear a little bit about the steps that we're taking from both Monty's perspective and the BPD. So I'll hand it over to you, Director Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. I want to thank members of the MONSE team who are here with me as well. Members of our lead team and of the victim services team sit with me today. In addition to that, agency partners sit with me, including BPD, the state's attorney's office, the Baltimore City Health Department, finance, and law is on standby if we need them. Before we jump into the presentation, I also want to take a moment to thank Dr. Warnken for spending the more than 50+ hours having conversations with dozens of Baltimoreans who either have lived experience and or are providing direct services to those who have been survivors of gun violence, whether as direct victims or as extended family members. As someone who participated in one of those interviews, I found the survey questions compelling and thoughtful, and this report exemplifies what an assessment should look like, given what we're trying to fix here. So, if you could advance next slide here. Just want to talk, sir, for a minute about what we're going to be talking to you all about. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about victim services as a mayoral priority. I think that you heard Dr. Warnken mention that one of the contributing pieces of documentation to the report was the Comprehensive Violence Prevention Plan. And so we'll talk about that. The work that MONSE has done to redefine victim, which is one of the recommendations that came out of this report, and a part of the work that was well underway at the time of this report's production. Going to turn it over to partners to talk about the evolution of our work, because we also heard Dr. Warnken say a couple of things, and you mentioned something too around the need to make sure that we've got cultural change and major investment and transformation in order to truly see the level of victim services support that we need. And want to speak through what's happening in the current state across these agencies, and also talk about the need that we're gonna require the scaffolding and the staffing and the operational resources in order to drive that cultural change and ultimately to transform the work. BPD will take some time to talk to you all about the ask, because in fact they asked PSP to generate this assessment. And I think that that's very indicative to the first point that Dr. Warnken made about this report being about listening. We'll talk about what the interagency coordination and collaboration is that is happening, and we'll walk through a timeline with you all. Next slide. So here's where we'll talk about the mayor's approach to public safety through the lens of public health. Victim services is his second priority in this first pillar. And again, even before the PSP report was generated, Mayor Scott made a commitment that we were going to be looking to provide a level of services to gunshot victims that had never been provided before this administration. There is no city agency, or was no city agency, that was specifically focused on making sure that we were humanizing folks who were victims of gun violence. While Monsi's predecessor agency, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, focused on sexual assault and focused on human trafficking and domestic violence, this is the first time that we've spent concentrated effort around making sure that there is a dedicated city agency in partnership with BPD and others to expand services to gunshot survivors. Next slide. And so back in January of this year, Monsi established a dedicated victim services lane. The victim services lane is intentionally responsible for filling the gaps that exist in providing victims and survivors of violent crime who haven't been traditionally served at the local level before. We hear the mayor say quite often that every shooting or every violent incident leaves behind a web of trauma, and that trauma isn't just the victim's trauma, it's bystanders' trauma, it's families, it's neighbors, and even the perpetrators of violence. That's why Monsi is very deliberate about broadening our definition of victim in ways that recognize the importance of addressing the deep traumatization of all the residents. And I think we heard the other council members talk about this, whether we're talking about housing or we're talking about bloodstained streets. As someone who unfortunately has a job that requires her to go to crime scenes, it is traumatizing to walk onto a scene and to see bodies and or to see blood remnants. And so making sure that when we think about victims, we're thinking about what victimization looks like in its entirety and how we do the work of unrooting the trauma that victimization causes. So the definition that Monsi is using includes everyone from the direct victim of gun violence or other violent crimes, such as a sexual assault, human trafficking, intimate partner violence, gun violence, also to witnesses and friends and families of that victim. It can also include others in the community, like neighbors and bystanders who are in need of those resources to heal from the exposure that we just talked about. And in a lot of cases, it also includes the perpetrator of the violence. So this broadened definition is very intentional and designed to make sure that we are taking into consideration the complexities around the range of factors that contribute to moving from a state of victimization to a state of healing in our city. And we know that that's a critical component of the work that we've got to do to reduce violence, perpetration, and re-victimization in our city. At this point, we're going to talk about the evolution of the work, and I'm going to turn it over to our partners at the Baltimore City Health Department to talk to you all about what they do with regard to victimization, specifically gun crime, and what the statistics look like for them.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Mason. I am actually one of the assistant directors over at the Office of Youth and Trauma Services at the Health Department, as well as the project director for the Youth Services and Advocacy Project, which I will be sharing on. In 2016, victim services funds were awarded by GOCCP to the Baltimore City Health Department to provide services to anyone who has been a victim of a crime. Between the years of 2017 and 2021, the program expanded from servicing 30 plus clients to 100 or more clients annually. Services also we service all forms of violence, anywhere from bullying all the way to first and second degree assault. We service families who have lost individuals to homicide, shooting victims, domestic violence, robbery, etc. Our services include relocation assistance, links to employment and employment development, case management, where we case manage the entire family, advocacy with victims' compensation, as well as advocating for them in schools, jobs, etc., links and connections to mental health services, temporary shelter assistance, connections to landlords, and more. Some of our partners are We Are Us, Baltimore City Schools, Monzi, BPD, State's Attorney's Office, Safe Streets, Roker and Roar, Center for Hope, Park Heights Renaissance, and more. Just this past year, we served 142 victims of crime throughout Baltimore City. We housed and provided rental assistance for more than 40 families in need of assistance due to being a victim of crime. We have connected more than 100 individuals to receive mental health services. We have assisted with finding employment for more than 20 individuals, including youth. We have paid for medical certifications for 5 of our participants. We have provided peer groups and victim services for youth in 4 Baltimore City public schools, Frederick Douglass, Connections High School, Renaissance Academy, and Coppin Academy, and actually now moving into Mervo. We have created Youth Ambassador Program, which has been conducting virtual trainings and community sessions around dating violence, human trafficking, community and gun violence, etc. Our program is small. Our staffing consists of 1 project director, supervisor, and 3 community advocates. Thank you.
We'll turn it over next to the State's Attorney's Office.
Good afternoon, City Council members. My name is Arcelia Green. And I am the Director of Victim Witness Services in the Office of the State's Attorney for Baltimore City. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the evolution of our office as well as the statistics in victim services for last year of 2021. Since 2015, through VOCA funding, the SAO Victim and Witness Services Unit has significantly expanded to improve services offered to victims and witnesses of crime. At the beginning of 2015, our unit was approximately 9 members, and through funding, our unit has significantly expanded to approximately 30 employees, most of which are advocates, victim advocates in the various different felony units in our office, as well as we have 3 relocation coordinators and 2 licensed social workers who see homicide survivors for grief counseling after they've experienced a homicide in Baltimore City. In 2017, our office collaborated with the Baltimore Police Department to create the Gun Violence Enforcement Division, GVED, which is a new prosecutorial unit at that time aimed at targeting violent gun offenders. The GVED unit, the Assistant State's Attorneys and the members of Baltimore Police Department, the detectives, we work side by side to apprehend, charge, and convict violent gun offenders in Baltimore City. Also in 2017, our office partnered with BPD, the homicide advocates, to provide services to survivors of homicide. In that partnership, the Baltimore Police Department homicide advocates would forward next of kin information to our office, to our homicide advocates, whereby we work with the homicide advocates there to provide timely notification to the next of kin to see if they do need services surrounding the homicide of their loved one. In 2018, our office renovated our victim and witness waiting room to a trauma-informed space for victims and witnesses to await court appearances. This is very important, as has been alluded to by our partners here in the hearing. It was needed to give the victims who are awaiting court appearances a sense of dignity and respect, to give them a sense of empowerment while they're waiting for their court appearance. That space is now more welcoming. It was designed by a nonprofit organization called Design Angels of America. And now this renovated space includes a dedicated play area for children, furniture, as well as a computer allowing visitors to access resources while they await for trial. In 2018, our office, along with other partners, which include the Sheriff's Office, Baltimore Police Department, the Housing Authority, and other stakeholders, we served on a Combating Witness Intimidation Steering Committee that allowed us to work with Equitas to identify new strategies for addressing witness intimidation and creating an action plan to implement those strategies. We began that work in 2018, but it has since been stalled due to different leadership, but this is a recommendation in the PSP report, and among our city agencies, we expect to resurrect that steering committee so that we can accomplish those goals that we started in 2018. In 2021, our office, along with MONSE and BPD, we began a victim services work group, bi-weekly meetings to collaborate and discuss strategies to fill in the gaps that assist in victim services throughout the city of Baltimore as identified in the PSP report. And earlier this year in 2022, the State's Attorney's Office established partnerships and strengthened collaborations with Springboard Community Services, ROAR, as well as LifeBridge Health Center for Hope to expand supportive services for crime victims and witnesses. Next slide, please, I'm sorry. And just to talk a little bit about our statistics from last year in victim services, in 2021, our office served over 12,600 victims and witnesses of crime. We relocated 128 victims and witnesses, as well as we served or offered counseling services to 711 survivors of homicide through our Family Bereavement Center. Thank you very much.
We'll hear from BPD next.
Good afternoon. I'm Deputy Commissioner Rich Worley, BPD, oversee operations. I'm going to go over the evolution of the work BPD Victim Services Unit. In 2016, we created the program with a focus on cold case homicide survivors. In 2070, the program expanded to serve current homicide surviving victims. The Victim Services Program coordinators have a dual role, serve department liaisons and as advocates for the survivor community. In 2020, we began the review of the unit potential for expansion and alignment with GVRS and community policing plan development, as well as the consent decree priorities. In 2021, VSU moved from homicide to the Deputy Commissioner's Office. We began the pilot coverage of non-fatal shootings in the Western District to align with our GVRS program. And the program has grown from one homicide advocate in 2016 to one supervisor, 9 service coordinators in 2022. In addition to, we have a couple others that we are about to bring on board in the Victim Services Unit. The ask, as you can see, this slide is pretty self-explanatory. I spent 4 years in the Western District back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I spent 5 years in the Southwest District. And basically, you see so many homicide and shooting victims, and the majority of them are young black males who are victimized by a gunshot wound, or either hopefully they survived, but a lot of them did not. I once calculated the numbers of how many homicides victims I've seen since my career, and I really don't even like to think about the number, but it's somewhere around 7,000. You figure 300 a year for so many years. It's and we'll go on to the next slide. This shows you our progress. 2017, the cold case anniversary date sent. We went from 2192 to 3510 in 2021. The current year homicide victims 343, we have 320, 335 in 2021. I can read the rest of the slides, but basically it shows that we are making progress. We have done improvements, and up next with our presentation is our manager of our Victim Services Unit, James Dixon. He has taken the wheel by the wheel and driven the car right into where we want it to go. As far as victim services, we're adding people, and we're going to continue to add people to hit non-fatal shootings, and we're also, once we get through that, we're going to move on to other crimes where we can help victims with the relationships with the BPD. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Dixon. I am BPD's Victim Services Manager. I was the first homicide survivor advocate at that time, hired in the Baltimore Police Department in 2016. Like DC Worley said, I started off with a focus just on cold case surviving victims, but since then we've moved on. Our team has expanded tremendously. And the previous slide just shows a little bit of the evolution of the work that we've done. You'll see from that previous slide, if you could just go back for 1 second, it just kind of shows where we started. 2017 was really a building year where we were inputting a lot of information into our database. We have our own specific database that we use to collate and collect information. In 2022, you'll see, and we also have our own specific clearance rate that we use to determine success as it pertains to how many people we were actually able to link with services. In 2021, we expanded into shootings, and we're continuing that work, and so that's why you see some of the numbers are a little bit down on the shooting side, but we're building that up. We realized it's a capacity issue, so right now we're servicing shootings in the Western District and the Southern District with a hospital response where we actually report to the hospital hours after the shooting has occurred to introduce ourselves to the victim, to see if they're interested in any types of services that can help them prevent either being a perpetrator of future violence or another victim of future violence. And so we're very excited about that program. Next slide, please. And as we continue to build out those services, it's important for us to build strong partnerships and relationships. Our main goal as BPD's victim service coordinators is to make sure that the surviving victim is not re-traumatized in any way, shape, or form. So we build out strong partnerships, and I want to thank our partners who are here in the room today at the SAO, also at MONSI, but also at the Health Department, and then some of our other partners who we continuously meet with, some of them on a weekly basis, some of them are on, it seems almost on a daily basis. The SAOs and myself, we almost consistently speak with one another. But Roberta's House, ROAR, My Empowering Impact, the Urban Trauma Center, Better Tomorrow Starts Today, BTST, and the South Baltimore Learning Center are just a few of the partnerships that we already have. We're always building out more, and as we continue to build out our shooting response, we need even more partnerships to help with those things that have been identified by those people in need. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could beg your indulgence for a minute and ask to go back to the ask slide, because you and I have specifically talked about wanting to make sure that Baltimore knows what problem we were looking to solve. And so I think contextually why you see this slide being called the ask, and I alluded to this before, is because BPD specifically asked PSP to do this. Right. This is a little bit different than what we saw in the consent decree, if you will, where Department of Justice came in and did an evaluation. This was a request by BPD, given the partnership with the Public Safety Partnership and the DOJ, who provides technical assistance and training and all of those sorts of things. Back in 2021, BPD specifically asked PSP to help them to better understand how to address and support victims of gun violence. And so the problem that BPD was looking to solve, problem, and making some air quotes here, is Let's make sure we understand what the problem is. The ask was aligned with making sure that we could develop our capabilities for GVRS. The problem analysis that came out of GVRS reiterated what we heard from Dr. Warnken, that Black men are the most impacted by gun violence, that the trends in the Western District are replicated across the entire city, and that in order to truly stop the cycles of violence that we're seeing in our city and improve trust, that BPD has to do the work with partners that are in this room, but also with our community-based partners in ways that allow us to engage and support victims in new, better, improved ways. And so key to that PSP report was making sure that community voice was a differentiator. BPD, other law enforcement agencies across this jurisdiction and across the country often ask the DOJ to help them do assessments. In many cases, those assessments don't get shared publicly. And that's because they're internally facing and they are speaking to the law enforcement agency and other kind of ancillary city agencies. It was with great intentionality that community-based partners were a part of this assessment. And so the ask, the problem, quite frankly, wasn't a problem in the purest sense. It is help us understand what the problems are so that we can proactively solve them. And I think that that's a shift that we have seen culturally over the years with our law enforcement partner in BPD saying, we want to know what the problem is before somebody comes in and tells us what the problem is. And so I think that context is critical not only for members of this council, but also for Baltimore City to know that BPD specifically asked for this level of assessment. If we could advance to the, great, you're already ahead of the game, thanks. So with regard to the interagency collaboration that MONSE is doing, the PSP meeting is a work group meeting where MONSE, BPD, the state's attorney's office, Dr. Warnken, meets and is one that we have fairly recently opened up to community members. One of the other points, I took copious notes while you were talking, Director, one of the notes that the director made was making sure that we're doing the work of co-creation, right, in order for it to be sustainable. And that absolutely is what we were preparing for. Want to be really clear, though, in saying that even after getting the PSP report, we did additional work. We did research outside of this work and looking at what victim services installations look like across other cities across this country to make sure that what we seek to construct is something that's going to make the most sense. We also did a current state process map for all 4 of the agencies that have presented to you today to understand how they specifically address victim services as independent agencies so that when we create an integrated model, we understand the gaps that we truly have to close and that this isn't just a series of BPD gaps. In addition to that, doing work around relocation with MONSE, with the state's attorney's office, BPD, the housing department, DHCD, the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, working to make sure, to the councilwoman's point earlier, that we really clearly focus on housing stability, the sheer volume of relocation requests that we see as a result of either direct victimization or being a witness to victimization or just feeling unsafe now in the neighborhood that you live in is high, and making sure that we're doing that work. And so those collaborations are happening as well. Next slide. And the series of the next slides will kind of close out our conversation, and then we'd welcome any questions that you all might have. This is a lot of words on a timeline. It's broken down into fiscal year 22, followed by a quarterly breakdown, and then fiscal year 23. I'm only going to highlight a few of the items that we've kind of taken care of in fiscal year 22 and what we're working toward this year. So in Q1 of fiscal year 22, BPD's VSU got realigned. You heard DC Worley mention that before, from an organizational structure perspective, to report to his office, to make sure that their expansion work could be inclusive of homicides and non-fatal shootings in the districts where we're piloting that work. Next slide. In the second quarter of last fiscal year, they began their coverage of those non-fatal shootings in the Western District aligned with GVRS. That's not something that they were doing before. Victim services were being provided to homicide victims, if you will, but never non-fatal shooting victims. And this goes back to humanizing people who get shot without asking them what they did to contribute to getting shot. Also, the unit expanded to make sure that they covered non-fatal shootings in the Southern District, because that's where we are piloting community policing plans with BPD. Third quarter of last year, Monsi broadened our definition of victim, and I've kind of talked to you all about what that looks like for us now. And as a result of broadening that definition, we really began to focus our discussions around individuals regardless of the type of incident, to make sure that they get treated with the dignity that they deserve and that they feel safe cooperating with BPD and with the state's attorney's office. I ask you to advance a couple of slides here. In Q3, we saw BPD's Victim Services Unit finalize their standard operating procedures to make sure that for non-fatal shootings that they expanded into kind of meshed with the SOPs that they had in place with regard to the homicide protocols that they put in place. They've shared those protocols with the other agencies that sit here with you today to make sure that we're really getting closer to a place of interagency collaboration. And then the group violence unit that's associated with GVRS participated in a specialized training around procedural justice, around victim services, around community engagement. In Q4 of last year is when I began to join Mayor Scott in responding to scenes of mass shootings and victims who were 18 years and younger, along with the police commissioner, to make sure that we understood what it looked like on the ground and to be able to provide real-time oversight and management with regard to familial supports and victim supports, but also real-time community-based supports. And then finally, for fiscal year 2022, we had PSP subject matter experts spend a couple of days with BPD to set the groundwork for what death notifications should look like in ways that are trauma-informed, and that would include detectives and victim services personnel. And then coming forward into this fiscal year, I'm going to move forward a few pages here to the first highlighted page, if you don't mind, Stephanie. In the first quarter of this fiscal year, BPD's Victim Services Unit attended the National Organization for Victims Assistance Training with PSP support. In addition to that, back in early August is when the victims assessment was released. It is also just a few weeks after that that Monsi was able to onboard its gun violence victim services manager. At this point, we're having regular monthly meetings with the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Board to streamline our existing processes. And then jumping forward a few slides, I mentioned this a moment ago. We've documented those current state processes and are willing to share them to the extent that this body would want to see where we are today as we move toward where we need to get to tomorrow to deliver truly integrated victim services. And I think this is probably the last slide here, last couple of slides here. I mentioned we invited CBOs who participated in the assessment to serve as work group members. The timing around this was really intentional. We wanted to not I don't want to say prematurely invite folks in, but we wanted to make sure that we also did additional due diligence. So when I talked about looking around the country to see what other jurisdictions were doing, not only within their law enforcement agencies, but whether or not they had city agencies or some sort of hybrid approach around how victimization was happening, was something that we thought was important. We also thought it was important for us to come to the table when we brought community members in with a documented, this is what we do today across all 4 of these agencies. And given that that was slated to be wrapped up on the 30th of September, and it was, we extended the invitation very shortly thereafter to community-based organizations to serve as a work group, and we're looking forward to having those conversations with them. In the coming months, you're going to see MONSE establish multidisciplinary meetings that include our hospital-based programs. I'm sure that members of this body know that we are currently negotiating contracts with 5 major medical systems for hospital violence intervention programming. Across those 5 major medical systems, 8 hospitals, the 8 hospitals that serve the majority of our gun violence victims are the ones that are going to be our partners in doing this work. And then finally, and then happy to open it up to questions here. In Q4 of this fiscal year, MONSE is going to be establishing an evaluation tool to determine the effectiveness of what victim services looks like across the entirety of the agencies. So we'll simultaneously have these 80 plus so recommendations that Dr. Warnken produced with us, on top of making sure that we've got a tool to evaluate how effective we are at doing that. At this point, I think we are all ready to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you so much, Director Jackson. Appreciate the very thorough presentation. I want to hand it over to Councilman Cohen. I know he's got to run in a little bit. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologies, I will have to jump, got a little child care pickup issue, but I will be on the hearing virtually. Thank you, technology. First, want to thank you, Director Jackson, and just want to thank also all of the partners in this work, the Human Trafficking Task Force, the Trauma Informed Care Task Force, of course, Roberta's House, LifeBridge, all of the many, many, many folks that do this work, ROAR and others. It is pretty thankless to be doing victim service advocacy, and so just want to say we appreciate it. And if there was ever an opportunity to co-create a response, this certainly is it. That said, wanted to drill down on one issue. This is actually after the report came out, but there was a story in the Baltimore Sun about a crime lab technician who had served for an extended period of time. Her name was Ms. Morse. She then quit, and she had been the primary and only technician on a murder case. She did not want to come in and testify after no longer being employed. And she, after multiple attempts by the state's attorney to compel her to come in and testify, was ultimately shackled and brought in chains and compelled to testify. Complicated situation. Obviously, we need folks who are part of the public safety chain to and are the only folks there that witnessed a crime scene to participate, but she was no longer employed by the city, and it was completely re-traumatizing for her to be shackled and brought in chains, essentially, in front of the court. This seems like an issue that there is a systems solve for, like not putting the blame on individual ASAs or anyone, but why can't there be a second crime lab technician on any of these cases or something else? Because this just seems like a classic example, sort of, I think, again, after this report came out, but where we took someone who was a witness and was part of the chain of evidence, and then I think did a number on her and her psyche, and completely re-traumatized her in a pretty horrific way. So I guess what I'm asking Director Jackson, BPD, State's Attorney, is can we figure out a way that when we have someone like that who's no longer employed, that they not be the only chain of evidence left? Because this seemed like a case where we inadvertently inflicted harm on an innocent person, with all good intention to try to catch a murderer, which is critically important, but caused an enormous amount of harm and stress to her. Sorry that question was a little convoluted, but I think this is Director Jackson, just thinking about ways that we can, and Deputy Commissioner Worley, that we can not re-inflict harm onto folks by building systems that are a little more thoughtful as it relates to witnesses and folks in the evidence chain.
No, I agree with that. That should have never happened, and we have worked on that collaboratively with all of our partners, and it won't happen again.
What's the specific
Well, someone
fix?
else can testify to the evidence, and I believe she had retired, so she.
Correct.
And once they retire, they retire. But we have other members of the crime lab who can testify to the same thing that she can.
Okay, so just so to be clear, because again, it was well reported in the Sun, and then I got a call from a couple of assistant state's attorneys that were frustrated because I spoke out publicly saying, I do not think this was the right way to handle this. Deputy Commissioner, just walk me through how that situation moving forward will be handled when you have a crime lab technician who is now retired. Who else in the chain of evidence could have stepped in, and moving forward, who will step in?
Basically, what happens with it, once someone retires, all the stuff, because there's more than one person on a crime scene. There's more than one crime lab technician on a crime scene. And the director has already put a system in place that when someone does move on, either retire, move on for another opportunity, everything that they have will transfer to another crime lab technician so that this doesn't happen again in the future, I'm sorry.
Okay, great. So just so to be clear, so there will be a second person on that scene who could be in the future called in order to avoid bringing in someone who is retired from service from Baltimore to testify instead.
Yes, there's always multiple. Any crime scene has multiple crime lab technicians that come to the scene to process the scene. It's usually 3, 4, or 5 of them that'll do it. So it all goes into the system under the crime lab, and someone else will come in to do the testimony if necessary.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I look forward to hearing the rest of the hearing on my phone. And again, thank you, Dr. Warnken, for the report. Thank you, Lydia, everyone involved. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilman. I've got a question. Director Jackson, you mentioned that we did a current state process map for victim services. I think that's going to be really helpful for us in making sure that we can direct people. Have we created the resource map? I know that was one of the recommendations from the report. Is the resource map a part of that?
We are in the process of creating a resource map right now. We have contracted with Benya in order to do that, and we anticipate having the mapping completed by December.
Great. And then as far as access to that resource, have we thought about how to make sure victims have that available? Also, people on the scene, our initial responders and secondary responders for those victims.
Absolutely. As we think about victim services, and I think Lydia alluded to this multiple times, the use of the phrase CVI ecosystem isn't rhetoric. It's not fancy words. It is truly what we need in order to make sure that the folks who are providing care to our victims know where they can get care from as direct service providers, but also so the victims know where they can go to get direct service provision in cases where they don't want to use an intermediary to do that. And so, yes, it is our intention to make sure that the resource map is one that is publicly accessible. In addition to that, the next phase of work coming after the resource map's completion is connected, but indirectly, if you will, to the victim services work, where Benya will be partnering with us to take that resource map and also determine what assisting community-based assets with capacity building looks like for them.
Awesome, thank you. The other question I have is regarding how we take the insights of this report and tie this into our broader crime plan. Is this something that can or should be rolled into our consent decree implementation efforts, tracked in the same way? Likewise with the Mayor's Violence Prevention Plan. And then also with regard to the suggestion that we co-create this effort, both of those plans went through a pretty rigorous outreach effort within our communities. Is that something that we're thinking about for this?
So, thanks for your question, sir. I would offer that the consent decree and the comprehensive violence prevention plan informed Director Warnken's report. And so while it doesn't outline the same level of detail found in this assessment, I would offer that both of those documents very clearly articulate what the expectations are of agencies in order to make sure that we're doing the work of comprehensive victim service provision. With that said, there is a comprehensive document that we use where we have broken out, while there are 21 larger recommendations, I mentioned earlier that there are over 80 detailed recommendations. And so we are using a tracker that identifies which agencies assigned as the primary lead on the work, who our corresponding BPD lead unit is, the overlap that it has with existing work, whether that's GVRS or community policing plans or expansion of the VSU. And we're also tracking our progress on that. And so out of 85 items, we've completed 9 of them so far, 49 of them are in progress, and 27 of them are in planning phases. So we absolutely are tracking this. To the second portion of your question with regard to a public share, the director made a point before about making sure that we are doing the work of co-creation and having broader conversations around, did we get it right? The invitation to those community-based organizations that participated in the initial assessment work is part one of what that looks like, where we've got a request out to folks to say, sign up for a work group, like tell us which of these recommendations you're most interested in having conversations about. And I think that becomes the ground lay for the broader work associated with making sure that we get larger community buy-in.
I'd be really interested to see what that second step of that process looks like. I realize you guys are juggling multiple large plans with tons of steps along the way. some of which may be repetitive under this plan, or it could be updated based on the insights of this report. So, I defer to you with regard to how we want to track that and keep that going forward. I do want to make sure that the insights from this report don't fall on deaf ears, or that we hear it and don't do enough about it to actually change anything. I think culture change is not easy. And we are currently trying to do significant culture change between the Mayor's Violence Prevention Plan and the consent decree. So where possible, tying those things together, both from a tracking perspective, but also especially from an implementation perspective, I think we should be thinking about that. So.
And I think, and I agree with that we don't need to track it a separate way. We have it in the consent decree as we satisfy the different paragraphs. Like, for example, youth interaction, victim services, and how to deal with the young individuals is all incorporated in that policy and in that training. In our new sex offense policy, same thing. It's incorporated in all those different policies so that we do treat the victim better than we did in the past. And I think one of the big, I know we had brought up that there was no example of that our officers couldn't come up with one. I just want to offer one example really quick that happened last week when an individual who was suffering possibly a behavioral crisis shot one of our officers. We took him into custody, and the first place that we took him was to the hospital to get him treatment. And when the hospital released him, then we did the processing. But the very first thing was get him into custody, get the weapon, and take him to the hospital to get treatment before anything else was done. So I think that proves how far we have come in a period of time.
It's a great example. Thank you. Councilwoman, do you have any questions?
I do, but Councilman Burnett has been on for a while, so I'll defer to him for right now, and then I've got 2 questions.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Councilman Burnett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I coming in okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things, and I'm not entirely sure who to address this to, but my office has heard from a number of victim-serving organizations that the majority of shooting or homicide victims or shooting victims that apply for the Criminal Compensation Board are denied reimbursement because it's chronically indicated by Baltimore Police Department officers that the victimization occurred in the commission of a crime without providing justification as to what those crimes are. Can someone speak about this and the potential impact, negative impact it's having on victims and their families?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Councilman. Absolutely, this is a big issue. Obviously, criminal injuries compensation is a state statute and an agency that is administered by GOCAP. But where BPD's involvement is so critical in those determinations is actually there's 3 requirements that a victim of crime must meet in order to be eligible to receive compensation funds. One is that they have to have reported to the police within 48 hours. So that's the first role of BPD, is obviously creating that police report and allowing the victim a copy of that. The second is that the victim has to be cooperating. Again, to Heather's point, cooperating as opposed to participating is a big word. But BPD has a form that goes, or it's actually a CICB form that goes to BPD for them to say, is this victim cooperating? And then the third criteria is the victim, was the victim engaged in any conduct that would have led to them becoming victimized? So in other words, I think we can all say intuitively, if you're robbing a bank and the armed guard at that bank shoots you and you have an injury as a result, you shouldn't get compensation for that. But what we have found, and what is very anecdotally, that there are almost no victims of non-fatal gunshots, and a very large number of homicide victims are also precluded by these requirements because BPD says no, not cooperating, and participating. And that form is a very cursory determination by PD. There's no sort of, investigatory evidence that needs to be attached. And what we have found in many of our cases, because there is so little investigation, as we know, only 10% of non-fatal shootings are even closed by BPD, and roughly 30 to 40% of the, I know it's gone up a bit, but of homicide investigations. So we know there isn't investigation happening in a lot of these cases, yet BPD has certified on these forms this victim is either not cooperating or culpable in some way or both. And that is a absolute barrier for that survivor to then get criminal injuries compensation. And as we noted, crime scene cleanup would be one of the things, but it's also funeral expenses. If somebody has died, it's reimbursement for any medical or therapy services that aren't insured by insurance. So if somebody, either doesn't have adequate coverage to get therapy or is paying out of pocket to see somebody who's out of network, all of those reimbursement for those services would not be reimbursed as a result of that certification. So it is an enormous barrier for a vast number of our clients to receive those benefits. There are many other challenges with criminal injuries compensation, not least of which is that people have to outlay the expenses first and then wait to get reimbursed, which is, for many of our clients, financially unfeasible. But yes, absolutely, to Councilmember Burnett's question, that certification absolutely creates a huge barrier for many of our clients. I'm sorry, I will just add to that when I very first started doing this work, when I met with the folks at Shock Trauma and asked them, have you ever been successful in getting criminal injuries compensation for any of the non-fatal gunshot survivors? They said without any irony at all, yeah, there was one once. He was an elderly guy from the county who was visiting the Inner Harbor and got shot while he was here. So again, very illustrative. I mean, it was obviously anecdotal, but very compelling information.
Yes, I'd just like to add, my office, what we do, we process many of these claims every single day. And what we've done is created a system whereas we've expedited the process to where a detective is able to make that determination a lot sooner in the process. We're having ongoing meetings with criminal injuries compensation to streamline the process. Part of the reason why they need a contributory conduct form is because the police department does not typically share a police report with another agency. So we're in the process right now of working with our records management system to create a system where we bypass that contributory conduct form and take that away from the detective and allow the claims examiners to make the determination based on the information that they have. In the process of what we're doing is also streamlining the process because what they need to process a claim is a police report, contributory conduct, and all the other information that they need to process the application. What we're doing now is eliminating a lot of the other people from that process, and BPD will be the agency that BPD's Victim Services Unit will be the agency or the unit that really kind of streamlines that process to make sure that claims are processed more thoroughly and quickly to make sure that people do get the answers that they need to the questions that they have. Like Ms. Watts said, it is an issue because you do have to pay out first and be reimbursed, but we're doing the best that we can to kind of streamline that process to make sure that claims are thoroughly processed.
Thank you. Councilman?
So I guess as a follow-up to what you said, because there's one part that you said that you were sort of taking the form away from the detectives. So does that mean that sort of this issue of not really knowing what crimes are blocking the ability to get compensation, is that barrier going to be removed? I didn't really understand that I didn't really know what to take from your response on that aspect of the question.
Well, I can speak. So we process, my unit, what we do is we process homicides and shootings in the Western District and the Southern District. We're in the process of, as we build out our shooting responses to more districts, we'll be able to handle more of those as well. The way that the process works is not set by BPD, it's set by criminal injuries compensation. They're the ones who sit, and their board who decide what they need to process a claim. These funds largely come from Victim of Crime Act funds, and they're used federally funded, administered through the state. And so what they need is certain guidelines and things from us to process a claim. We don't have any control over what they need. Is their requirements. They're the ones who set those standards. All we can do is kind of make sure that we give them what they need in order to process the claim. When it comes to a homicide, we're in that process, and we work exclusively with the detectives to help them to understand that what you put on this form is binding. So detectives are usually very aware of that and will not just willy-nilly, for lack of a better term, sign their name to something that may come back in a legal proceeding to be something that may be culpable when it comes to a criminal proceeding. So detectives are very cautious when it comes to that information, but we walk them through the process and try to make sure that we process those claims. But in the future, what we're doing, because we're still building out those protocols with criminal injuries, we have a meeting with them this coming Friday to kind of continuously refine this process. And what we're trying to do, and what the goal is through those meetings that we're having, is to get more clarity on them from what they actually need to process a claim. And then we will be able to send those documents directly to them so that they can process it. They've assured us that because in many jurisdictions, the contributory conduct form is not used. The reason that they need it from BPD or from Baltimore City is because BPD does not share open police reports. If it's an open investigation, that information is not shared. So they've relayed to me that what they need from us is a more detailed police report, and then they would not need the contributory conduct form.
Councilman, if I could here, I would say that the ultimate goal here is to work with the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board to have them reevaluate all of the criteria that they have in place right now for victims to receive compensation, whether that is the terms that we're talking about or the timing with regard to the payment happening, to make sure that folks don't just continue to, feel re-victimized and re-traumatized as they are attempting to address the issues that were sparked by that initial traumatization. But we've got some work to do. I would say that what we've heard from Director Dixon is that we've started to remove some of the bottlenecks that have been preventative for folks, and we still have to get to this place where CICB is willing to take a hard look at all of the terms under which they're willing to compensate for victims.
And if I could just add briefly to this, I think Ms. Watts, Mr. Dixon, and Director Jackson have covered it well. There's a section in the report starting on page 30 that lays out some of the detailed information that we gathered in the course of the assessment about all of the process and procedure barriers that are currently making a big difference and adding to that inequity, including this very significant gatekeeping role that BPD plays currently. But I just wanted to underscore and put a national context on the need for legislative reform here. And we're very specific about that in this report too, that all the process changes in the world aren't going to address some of the fundamental problems that structurally prevent certain victims from accessing this and certain victims from not, and that there have been sort of a groundswell of legislative changes in states across the country that have started to lead the way in this, and now a federal effort to evaluate the guidelines there. So I wanted to offer that context.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Ramos.
Did the councilman have another question? No.
Councilman Burnett, you're done, right?
No, I did have one more, but I didn't know if you were counting the follow-up as a second question. I can wait for Ramos, and if you want to come back.
You can go ahead and finish your second question. Go for it.
Okay, so the second one was around earlier in the presentation, and I apologize, I missed the individual's name, but there was a representative from the state's attorney's office that noted that there'd been something, and maybe I got this wrong in my notes, but I just want to make sure I got the number right, something like 12,000 victims were served. Just wanted to see if we could get more information on what that ecosystem of support has been for those individuals.
Yes, good afternoon, Councilman Burnett. This is
Please use the microphone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Councilman Burnett. This is Arcelia Green, the Director of Victim Services, here representing the State's Attorney's Office. The 12,600 victims and witnesses of crime that office served last year, it is a lot of supportive services. It's not one particular area. We've serviced victims and witnesses in the area of advocacy, referrals to other agencies for supportive services for the victims of crime. We have serviced those victims through court accompaniment, phone calls just to redirect them to services. It's a lot of different services, interpretation requests, interpretation, travel accommodations to get the victims and witnesses to trial when need be. There's no one particular area, but those are just some of the resources and services that we've provided the victims and witnesses last year. And that number is spanning across 20 or so advocates. So we have about over 20 advocates in different areas of the office, different prosecutorial units, and each of those advocates, respond to the various needs of victims and witnesses that they incur as a result of being assigned in a particular unit.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'm glad to know that the youth services will be starting to be provided at Mervo. I heard a little bit about it earlier in the week. Super important given what our young people have been through there. The principal has been, I think, phenomenal in trying to get as many resources as possible to the young people and to the coaches and to the teachers. So any support that you can give her is going to be critical as myself and others are trying to get that community support as well. So I'm just happy to help, whatever you need from me. I obviously am not an expert in this field, but I'm learning. And I know that it has been a big deal there, obviously, given what those young people have been through. My young people, I call them my young people, have been through the last few years, so I appreciate that. The main question that I had was, there's a lot of services that are being started, that are continuing, and I saw one line on the slide saying you're partnering with Esperanza Center. So tell me a little bit more about, obviously with the Latino population growing in our city, that victim services need to also be done in a way that people understand, so in Spanish, but also culturally competent as well. Obviously, we have different traditions in our different countries as to how to handle things like this, so it's a lot more complicated. But I'd be interested to hear, not just, at all the levels, we can go over it and then we can have a more specific conversation, but, from that moment to then the additional supports is going to be critical for our community. So if somebody can talk a little bit about the services, are we hiring members of the Latino community to help us out with this? Are we just using language? That was the other thing, is sort of the access point.
So I'm glad to say that BPD, this has been a priority for our victim services unit. We do have a Spanish-speaking victim service coordinator that works on our team. She not only assists our unit, but she also assists the detectives as well when there's a language barrier for someone who is Latino or Spanish-speaking. So that has been a priority for us. We're continuing to build out and want to even expand to even more diversity to add people to our team that can speak to more levels of diversity within crime victims within the city. But we do have someone that's dedicated on our team, and then we also do have a partnership that we're building out with the Esperanza Center as well.
And even outside of the victim services, this has happened for a couple years now. When we see at one point the Hispanic population was being targeted in the southeast with robberies, so our neighborhood coordination officers met. We have a Spanish-speaking officer there. We helped them to open bank accounts so they weren't carrying large sums of cash with them. So those are things that the officers are doing on their own and in the districts outside of victim services. So they're trying to work around so they're not victimized.
Well, our community is growing all over the city now, so we're going to need a lot of that assistance. I'm grateful for the community service folks in Southeast. I'm very familiar with what's happening there, and I'm grateful. Just noticing again that our community is growing substantially all over the city, and so we want to make sure that those services are available.
From the perspective of the Office of Youth and Trauma Services, I would like to recognize Kimberly Legree, our other assistant director. She's been a lead on our office actually hiring 2 community aides that will focus on a Latino population as well as the LGBTQ population as well, directly getting us connected to those populations and individuals who they can funnel referrals to us that we're able to service. So we're definitely in the process of hiring for that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And I
happy to
just
help.
want to add that Roar, we're currently at 17 staff, but of those 17 staff, we have 1 bicultural, bilingual, Latinx paralegal. We have a native Spanish speaker, a native French speaker, a native Arabic speaker, a German speaker, and a second French speaker. And that's just of our staff of 17. And then we do avail ourselves of AUDA's language services. They get funded by GoCap to provide those services to victims in Maryland as well, even though they're a district-based, a DC-based agency, and they provide translators and interpreters for pretty much any language, and obviously with a very large number of Spanish speaking, because the other issue is getting documents translated as well. So it's not just the translation, but also the not just the interpretation, but a translation of documents as well, which can be very costly. So we're very grateful for that support from AIDA.
Good afternoon, Councilman Ramos. For the State's Attorney's Office, we have currently 7 bilingual advocates who speak Spanish. There is 1 relocation specialist who is bilingual. We have 1 bilingual advocate in homicide and relocation. We currently have 3 bilingual advocates in our special victims unit, 1 in felony and 2 in misdemeanor. We have a bilingual advocate in juvenile. And then in addition, we have a bilingual advocate who is housed in our victim witness waiting room, who is not assigned to a particular unit. So that advocate is available for all of the units in which do not have a bilingual advocate housed in that unit.
Thank
that can
you.
assist.
Mm-hmm. I think I had shouted out Evelyn Vargas a long time, for many years. We know she's a rock star, and, she was really a pioneer in making sure that, SAO had everything that they needed. And so I'm grateful for her to still be here as part of the fight. So thank you. Thanks for that. It sounds like there's a huge consciousness around the fact that, we have people who speak other languages. MEMA translate everything into 5 languages. So, and that's the beauty of our city, is that we've got, a lot of people coming in, and so we want to make sure that, God forbid they become a victim, that the services are there. So I really appreciate your intentionality about that, and I'm happy to help try to circulate or whatever to try to get more folks hired. So appreciate that. The second question was around the housing piece and the rental assistance piece. It was it's very clear that that is such a huge issue that we need to address. And I have a piece of legislation that I've held because I know that the commissioner and Director Jackson, you've been working on trying to come up with a rental assistance package for the that participants in ROCA and ROAR and others, but also just in terms of this referral piece. So can you tell me what the status is of all that is? I also introduced a bill to try to lower the threshold to be able to make more money with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, to be able to have specifically for rental assistance for this work. So I'm hoping that all that can dovetail together.
Thanks for the question, Councilwoman. I would offer that the conversations continue between BPD, MONSE, DHCD, HABC, and other partners around what that comprehensive package looks like. And there are some individual standalone sub-packages, if you will. Specifically through the group violence reduction strategy, we do offer relocation services to any person who is potentially deemed as group member involved and has either been a shooting victim or who is an imminent threat of becoming a shooting victim or a perpetrator. Right. To date, or at least through August 31st, because I want to make sure that I account for the September numbers and I don't have them in front of me now. MONSE had taken care of relocation for folks to the tune of about $76,000. Since starting GVRS. We're talking about the relocation not only of individuals, but whole families. We're talking about some cases where folks have lost limbs and they need housing with special accommodations in order to account for their new disability, if you will. We also recently partnered with YSAP, with Mark Mason down here at the health department, in order to provide a referral for a relocation for a family where we saw a police-involved shooting of an individual who was dealing with a mental health crisis, and making sure that his family could get the supports that they needed. And so I would say the work continues. We have not locked in on a finalized comprehensive package just yet. And I would ask BPD, to the extent that it makes sense to share what you all are doing around a relocation, feel free to.
Can we make the comments brief? I do want to give folks an opportunity to testify before
Yes,
we
sir.
close out.
We do have a relocation services we offer to anyone who requests it. If they're family, usually the last one I believe we had was a victim of a homicide. His family wanted to be relocated. Unfortunately, a lot of people that we offered to turn it down. Mm-hmm. But we do have services that we work along with the state's attorney's office to relocate any victims or any families of victims who qualify and want to be moved.
I think there's the services and then there's the money. Because the rental assistance, rent is not cheap, and rental assistance, particularly moving, and we do have a security deposit program in place. So I'm interested in trying to figure out the best way to make sure that we have both in alignment. No, I appreciate that. And I'm familiar with the SAO's program as well.
Yep, just one last thing, if I could. With regard to rental assistance, MONSE isn't necessarily providing rental assistance. We are paying rent and security deposit for anywhere between 6 months to 12 months.
Right, so yes. So
Just wanted to be clear there.
No, I appreciate that. So it's not partial, it's full. Right, I got it. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we want to get to testimony.
Thank you, Councilwoman. So we're going to now move on to public testimony. We didn't have anybody signed up in the back, but if you would like to testify, we are going to allow 2 minutes. And that goes for folks online as well. Please use the raise hand function, and we will acknowledge you. For folks who are on the phone and cannot raise their hand, we'll check on you to see if you'd like to testify. Lisa Malak.
I'm the executive director of Let's Thrive Baltimore, and I work with victims of violence and survivors in Baltimore City. We've been having a lot of issues. I'm hearing there's a lot of people in here who are offering rent support to these victims, which I was never made aware of other than Mark Mason from the health department, who helps when he can. So I would really, really like to get a copy of that list. I just actually had a meeting with Councilman Zeke Cohen a few weeks ago in regards of the lack of services that victims in Baltimore City is getting, in spite of, this public health crisis that we have with violence, and there's victims always calling for assistance. So these services that's being offered needs to be made public, because I work with victims every day, every single day, over 120 something victims a year. And I had no idea that anyone, and we're always looking for support for these victims, where I'm going in my own pocket and providing victim services to residents of Baltimore City. So I would love to have a copy of that list. I've reached out to several agencies in regards to letting them know that I do provide victim services, and I still was not made aware that anyone is providing assistance with relocating or rental support, which we have victims actually, Malaya, the 13-year-old girl that was murdered, her mother is one of the survivors I'm working with. She's staying in a hotel. She's been in there almost a year. Malaya's, she was killed in front of Lillian Jones Recreational Center. She's been in that hotel for over a year, coming up in November. I have to hear her cry almost every night. She has to spend her days inside of a hotel because she still hasn't been relocated. So these are just the things that I would really, really like, some transparency on. If there's money available for these families, please let the people who are really out here on the ground doing the work know, because it's really hard trying to help these families when you don't even have the funding to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malak. If you have any additional testimony, please feel free to send that to the committee, and we'll make sure to keep it as part of the record. Appreciate your testimony. All right, we have one caller. We're going to unmute you, and if you'd like to testify, please let us know. If not, please say you would not like to testify. Okay. I'll give another moment in case anyone in person would like to testify. All right, public testimony has concluded. I want to thank our agencies for taking this seriously, and certainly taking the insights and criticisms that the report has brought out seriously. I look forward to how we integrate this into our accountability measures that we've been using for many of reports like this. We get these all the time. I think it's really a matter of how we actually implement the changes to see these things through. I really want to thank Ms. Warnken and Ms. Watts for walking us through the report, giving us some of the highlights, and really helping us understand some of the importance of the insights from the report. With that, this committee will now go into recess. Thank you.